Chapter 10 of Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. The Treaty of Versailles. It has been previously stated that the Treaty of Versailles was one of the most iniquitous documents ever signed by the representatives of the so-called civilized nations. The injustice perpetrated upon the German people by the terms of the peace treaty made another world war inevitable. The circumstances surrounding the signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918 must be understood. The German High Command did not ask for the armistice because their armies were in danger of defeat. When the armistice was signed, the German armies had never been defeated on the field of battle. The German High Command asked for an armistice so that they could devote their efforts towards preventing a communist revolution. Rosa Luxemburg, and her Jewish-dominated Spartacus Bund had planned to duplicate in Germany what Lenin had achieved in Russia exactly 1 year previously. The armistice was signed as a prelude to a negotiated peace. It is of the utmost importance to remember this fact because the armistice entered under those conditions is far different from unconditional surrender. The events which caused the German High Command to realize their danger on the home front were as follows. Rosa Luxemburg's revolutionaries infiltrated into the German High Seas Fleet. They became very active in 1918. They spread rumors that the ships and their crew were to be sacrificed in an all-out battle with the combined British and American navies. The rumor mongers stated that the purpose of the battle was to cripple the combined Allied fleets to such an extent they would be unable to defend the British coasts against their invasion planned to bring the German warlords victory. The communist cells exhorted the German seamen to mutiny because they claimed that the planned invasion of Britain was doomed to failure due to the fact that British scientists had developed a secret weapon. According to the rumor mongers, invading craft could, by the use of chemicals fired from guns ashore or dropped from planes, be surrounded by a sea of flames. Fire, heat, and lack of oxygen would create conditions in which nothing human could survive. The subversives argued that the only way to avoid such a fate was to bring about a revolution to end the war. The German seamen mutinied the 3rd of November 1918. On November 7th, a large body of Marines deserted while on their way to the Western Front. They had been told that they were going to be used to spearhead the rumored invasion of Britain. Meantime, uprisings had caused shutdowns in many German industrial centers. Subversives talked defeatism. Conditions deteriorated until on November 9th the Kaiser abdicated. The Social Democratic Party immediately formed the Republican government. The armistice was signed November 11th, 1918. The communist leaders of the Spartacus Bund had placed themselves in key positions within the new government and throughout the armed forces. Their combined effort to create chaotic conditions everywhere. Rosa Luxemburg then played her trump card. She forced the socialist government to order the immediate demobilization of the German armed forces. This action prevented the German High Command from using their well-disciplined troops to prevent the pending revolution, which broke out in January 1919. Before she usurped power in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg was promised the same financial assistance and military aid the international bankers had given to Lenin and Trotsky a year before. The initial stages of her revolutionary effort were financed by the funds they made available through the Soviet ambassador Zhov. The revolutionary effort only failed to accomplish what Lenin had achieved in Russia when the promised aid failed to materialize after Rosa had launched her initial onslaughts. Then she realized her Jewish Spartacus Bund had been betrayed by the very man she considered her friends and supporters. This incident alone should prove that the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement is not concerned about the welfare of the Jews any more than it is about the Gentiles. The majority of the dictators of the WRM are men who descended from the Khazars, Tartars, and the other Mongol, Asiatic, non-Semitic races. They adopted the Jewish religion to suit their own selfish purpose between the 7th and 8th centuries. They have used Jews exactly as they have used Gentiles as pawns in the game. The purpose of the double cross was twofold. The men who plot the plan the world revolutionary movement did not want Germany Sovietized until after they had used the German people to fight another war against Britain. They calculated the Second World War would render both empires so utterly exhausted that they could then be easily subjugated by the resources of the USSRs they controlled under Lenin's dictatorship. In order to start a Second World War, they considered it was necessary to build up within Germany an intense anti-Semitic hatred for the purpose of dividing Europe into two opposing camps, fascists and anti-fascists. The plan required all communist countries to remain neutral in a military sense, while their agents did everything possible to aggravate the adverse conditions the masterminds created. After the Jewish-dominated revolution collapsed for want of aid, the German Aryan race took a full measure of revenge on the Jewish people. Thousands of Jews, men, women, and children were rounded up during the night and executed. Rosa Luxemburg and her right-hand man, Karl Liebknecht, were captured and shot in the head like mad dogs by a German lieutenant. Thus, once again, a large number of Jews were made to pay the penalties for the crimes of a small group of international gangsters who used them as pawns in the game of international intrigue. To prolong and intensify the hatred of the German people for the Jews, propaganda blamed the Jews for bringing about the military defeat of the Germans' armed forces, and the unjust and humiliating terms enforced by the Treaty of Versailles. Propaganda strengthened the trend towards National Socialism in Germany by representing Britain, France, and the United States as selfish capitalist countries influenced and controlled by the international Jewish bankers. Thus, the way was prepared for the advent of Hitler. Soon after the armistice was signed, the international bankers instructed Lenin to consolidate the communist gain and to prepare to defend the Soviet states against capitalistic aggression. Lenin announced this as his policy. Trotsky disagreed bitterly. He advocated immediately revolution in all European countries which remained to be subjugated. He wanted to help Germany's Spartacus Bund in order to keep the revolutionary spirit alive. Lenin insisted that their first duty was to establish the communist sphere of influence in all countries of the world located between the 35th and the 45th parallels of latitude in the northern hemisphere. Lenin stated he would only content revolutionary action in countries within those limits. The most important countries were Spain, Italy, Greece, certain sections of the Asia Minor, including Palestine, certain sections of China, and the area both sides of the border in Canada and the United States. Lenin warned the Third International Lenin warned the Third International that it was the duty of the revolutionary leaders in all those countries to organize their parties so as to be ready to take over their governments when outside forces created favorable conditions to revolts. Rosa Luxemburg's failure was cited as an example of what would happen if revolutionary action was taken immediately. Lenin's strategic plan is known in military circles as the Musk-Ox plan, because these northern animals have been able to survive against the attacks of all their enemies by the simple expedient of forming a circle with their heads pointing out and their tails in. Calves are placed inside the circle. Wolves and bears could not attack the herd from the flank or rear. If they attacked head-on, they were gored to death, or cut to ribbons by the razor-like hooves of the oxen. Lenin justified himself for abandoning Rosa Luxemburg on the grounds that he had thus been able to organize the Soviet armies to withstand the combined onslaught of the capitalist countries from 1919 to 1921. In 1921, Lenin informed the members of the Third International that Spain was to be the next country Sovietized. He blamed Rosa Luxemburg as being responsible for the wave of anti-Semitism which had swept over Germany. The Third International then dispatched Karl Radek to lead communism in Germany. He was instructed to use his own initiative as far as recruiting, organizing, and training the party was concerned. But he was warned not to take revolutionary action until ordered to do so by the Comintern. The Comintern was under control of Lenin, and therefore the international bankers. Having settled the internal conditions in Germany to suit their long-range plans, the international gangsters next turned their attention to Palestine. Palestine occupied a central geographical position in their overall plans for world conquest. In addition to that, they knew that the world-famous geologists had located vast deposits of mineral wealth in the area around the Dead Sea. They therefore decided to sponsor political Zionism to further their twofold purpose. 1. To force the nations of the world to make Palestine a national home for the Jews so they would have a sovereign state which they would control by reason of their wealth and power. If their long-range plans matured to the extent of a Third World War, they could use their sovereign state to extend the control they exercised over their communized nations throughout the whole world. When this was accomplished, they would be able to crown the head of the group, king of the universe, and God upon this earth. 2. They had to secure control of the $5 trillion worth of minerals wealth they knew was hidden in and around the shores of the Dead Sea. Events will show how they went about their dual purpose. After Britain, France, and the United States had been committed to form a national home for the Jews in Palestine by the Balfour Declaration in April 1917, Lord Allenby was ordered to drive the Turks out of Asia Minor and occupy the Holy Land. The fact that Palestine was to be turned over to the Jews was not made known until after the Arabs had helped Allenby accomplish this task. The general impression was that Palestine should be a British protectorate. Immediately after Lord Allenby's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the international bankers persuaded the Allied governments to appoint their political emissaries as a Zionist commission. Officially, the members of this commission were sent to Palestine to act as liaison between the military administration and the Jews. Their real purpose was to advise General Clayton so his military administration would further their secret plans. The Zionist Commission went into effect in March 1918. Members of the Zionist Commission included Major Ormsby Gore. He afterwards became Lord Harlech. He was a director of the Midland Bank, the Stanford Bank of South Africa, and the Union Corporation. Major James de Rothschild, the son of Edmund de Rothschild of Paris, who had formerly owned the Rothschild colonies in Palestine. Major de Rothschild afterwards became a liberal member of the British Parliament. He served in this capacity from 1929 to 1945. He was appointed parliamentary secretary in the Churchill Labour coalition government. Lieutenant Edwin Samuel afterwards became chief censor for the British government during the Second World War. He was appointed chief director of Palestine Broadcasting after the State of Israel was established in 1948. Mr. Israel Saif, he was the director of Marks and Spencer's, the huge British department stores. He was a close associate of all the international bankers. He was appointed chairman of the Political and Economic Planning Committee. He was permanent member of the Brain Trust, which advised successive British governments. His standing in Great Britain was very similar to that of Bernard Baruch in the United States of America from 1918 to date. Mr. Seif rendered the international bankers such outstanding service that he was made a commander of the Orders of Maccabees. Leon Simon, he was afterwards knighted and placed in charge of the British General Post Office. He controlled all telegraph, telephone, and cable facilities. The remaining members of the commission were Dr. Elder, Mr. Joseph Cohen, and Mr. Chaim Weizmann, all close friends of wealthy Zionists in America. Sir R. Storrs says the Zionist Commission was sent to Palestine before the peace conference started in order to create an atmosphere favorable to establishing a nation home for the Jews, and also to stimulate its financial supporters. The international bankers dominated the conference, which culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. This is proved by the fact that in January 1919, Mr. Paul Warburg, who drafted the Federal Reserve System in the United States of America, arrived in Paris to head the American delegation. His brother Max arrived to head the German delegation. Comte de Saint-Hilaire says, "Those who look for the truth elsewhere than in the official documents know that President Wilson, whose election had been financed by the Great Bank of New York, Cunnin Loeb & Co., rendered almost complete obedience to its beck and call." Dr. Dillian states, "The sequence of expedients framed and enforced in this direction were inspired by the Jews, i.e., representatives of the international bankers assembled in Paris for the purpose of realizing their carefully thought out programs, which they succeeded in having sustainedly executed." The Mandate of Palestine was drafted by Professor Felix Frankfurter, the eminent American Zionist, who afterwards advised Chief Advisor in the White House to who became Chief Advisor in the White House to President Roosevelt. He was assisted by the Right Honorable Sir Herbert Samuel, Dr. Jacobson, Dr. Philwell, Mr. Satcher, Mr. Landman, Mr. Ben Cohen, Mr. Lucian Wolfe, who exercised tremendous influence over Mr. David Lloyd George. He was said to possess all the secrets of the British Foreign Office. At the preliminary conferences, Mr. Medell, whose real name was Rothschild, was private secretary to Mr. Clemenceau of France, and Mr. Henry Morgenthau was the U.S. delegation in a general supervisory capacity. He was the father of the man who afterwards became President Roosevelt's financial secretary. Another man affiliated with the international bankers was Mr. Oscar Strauss, who took a leading part in forming the League of Nations and moldering its policies so that they fitted in with the international gangsters' long-range plan for ultimate world domination. Mr. Lucian Wolfe says on page 405 of his Essays in Jewish History, a small group of other distinguished Jews appear as signatories of the peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles is signed for France by Louis Clotz. He was afterwards implicated in shady financial transactions and retired from public life. E.d. Baron Somino for Italy and Edwin Montagu for India. Mr. Harold Nicholson, author of Peacemaking, 1919 to 1945, page 243, states that Wolfe suggested to him that all Jews should have international protection while retaining all national rights of exploitation. Mr. George Bartholdt says in Le Problème Juif, page 38, the Jews who surrounded Lloyd George, Wilson, and Clemenceau are to blame for creating a Jewish peace. Once again, the Jewish race is blamed for the sins of a few ruthless financiers. In the spring of 1919, Bela Kun usurped power in Hungary. He tried to put Lucian Wolfe's ideas into practice. Bela Kun's dictatorship lasted only 3 months, but during that time, tens of thousands of Christians were dispossessed and ruthlessly murdered. The victims included working men, army officers, merchants, landowners, professional men and women, priests, laymen. The new International Yearbook of 1919 says in part, the government of Bela Kun was composed almost exclusively of Jews who held also administrative offices. The communists had united first with the socialists, who were not of the extremely radical party, but resembled somewhat the labor parties or trade union groups in other countries. Bela Kun did not, however, select his personnel from among them, but turned to the Jews and constituted virtually a Jewish bureaucracy. History records that after 3 months of systematic pillage, rape, and wholesale murder, Bela Kun was deposed. Instead of being executed, he was interned in a lunatic asylum. His release was arranged by agents of the powerful group he had served so well. He returned to Russia and was put in charge of the Cheka, which terrorized the Ukrainians into subjugation when Stalin was ordered to collectivize agriculture in the Soviets. 5 million peasants were starved to death for refusing to obey the edicts. Over 5 million more were sent to forced labor in Siberia. When Stalin tried to turn Spain into a communist dictatorship in 1936, Bela Kun was chosen to organize the Reign of Terror in Spain. The power of the international bankers is well illustrated by the incident that happened during the preliminary conferences held in Paris in 1919. The negotiations tended to stray away from the policies set by the international bankers. Thereupon, Jacob Schiff of New York sent President Wilson, who was attending the Paris conference, a 2,000-word cable. He instructed the President of the United States what to do in regard to the Palestine mandates, German reparations, Upper Silesia, the Saar, the Ganzin corridor, and Fiume. The cablegram was dated May 28, 1919. Schiff sent it in the name of the Association of the League of Free Nations. Upon receipt of the cablegram, President Wilson immediately changed the directions of the negotiations. Of this incident, Comte de Saint-Aulaire said, "The Treaty of Versailles on these 5 questions was dictated by Jacob Schiff and his co-religionists. It must be pointed out again that the rank and file of the Jewish people had absolutely nothing to do with the framing the policy which international bankers insisted. Lloyd George, President Wilson, and Premier Clemenceau carry out." As soon as the Allied governments had been persuaded to make Palestine a British protectorate, as demanded in the cable, the international bankers instructed their agents that the terms of the peace treaty were to be made so severe that it would be impossible for the German people to tolerate them very long. This was part of the plan to keep the German people hating the British, French, American, and the Jews so they would be ready to fight again to regain their legal rights. Immediately, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The phony capitalist Bolshevik War was started. This war enabled Lenin to justify his policy by which he abandoned the German revolutionaries to their fates in order to consolidate the gains he had already made in Russia. The war against Bolshevism was never permitted to endanger Lenin's dictatorship. It was ended in 1921. The net result was that the Bolsheviks gained tremendous amounts of prestige while the capitalist countries lost a similar amounts. This paved the way for the agents of the international bankers to suggest in the interest of permanent peace that the Soviet states be admitted to membership in the League of Nations. The British government, always obedient to the wishes of the international bankers, was the first to comply with the new requests. France followed suit on October 28, 1924. After the infamous Litvinov had worked on Henry Morgenthau and Dean Acheson, who were both dominated by Felix Frankfurter and Louis de Brandeis, President Roosevelt organized the Soviets on November 16th, 1933. The League of Nations accepted the Soviet states as members. From that day on, the League of Nations was nothing more or less than an instrument in the hands of Stalin. His agents molded its policy and activities to suit the long-range plans of those who directed the world revolutionary movements. Once the communist countries had been admitted into the League of Nations, Grand Orient Masons who were delegates or on the staff took charge. Wickham Stead, former editor of the Times London was one of the best informed men in the world. On more than one occasion, he discussed the fact that the international bankers dominated international affairs. He made this definite statement just after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. I insisted that, unknown to him, the prime movers to make the Allied powers acknowledge the Bolshevik dictatorship were Jacob Schiff, Warburg, and other international financiers, who, 244, wished above all to bolster up the Jewish Bolsheviks in order to secure a field for German and Jewish exploitation of Russia. Leo Max, writing in his August issue of the National Review 1919, stated, "Whoever is in power in Downing Street, whether conservative, radicals, coalitionists, or pseudo-Bolshevik, the international Jews rule the roast. Here is the mystery of the hidden hands, of which there has been no intelligent explanation." Once again, the word Jew should have been banker or gangster. It would be just as reasonable to blame all Roman Catholics for the crime of few Roman mafia chieftains who had given up the practice of their religion for many years. When Winston Churchill visited Palestine in March 1921, he was asked to meet a delegation of Muslim leaders. They protested that the ultimate objective of political Zionism was to give the natural resources of Palestine to the Jews. They pointed out that the Arabs had occupied Palestine for over 1,000 years. They asked Churchill to use his influence to correct what they considered a great injustice. Churchill was recorded as saying in reply, "You may ask me to repudiate the Balfour Declaration and to stop Jewish immigration. This is not in my power, and it is not my wish. We think it is good for the world, good for the Jews, good for the British Empire, and good for the Arabs also, and we intend it to be so." When Churchill gave the Arabs his reply, he was in all probability thinking of the threat issued by Chaim Weizmann, who had been an agent of the international bankers for many years. Just a year before Churchill's visit to Palestine, Weizmann had made an official statement of policy which was published in Jüdische Rundschau, number 4, 1920. He said, "We will establish ourselves in Palestine whether you like it or not. We can hasten our arrival, or you can equally retard it. It is, however, better for you to help us so as to avoid our constructive powers being turned into a destructive power, which will overthrow the world." Weizmann's statement must be studied in conjunction with another declaration made by an international banker to a gathering of Zionists in Budapest in 1919. When discussing the probabilities of a super government, he was quoted by Comte de Saint-Hilaire as saying, "In the management of the New World, we give proof of our organization both for revolution and for construction by the creation of the League of Nations, which is our work. Bolshevism is the accelerator, and the League of Nations is the brake on the mechanism of which we supply both the motive force and the guiding power. What is the end? That is already determined by our mission. One government." The two statements combined show the international extent of their secret ambitions. 8 years after I had finished this chapter of the original manuscript, the following report came into my possession through the Canadian Intelligence Service. Because the statements made at the conference held in Budapest on January 12, 1952, supports my conscientious contentions made in 1944 and confirms the conclusions I had arrived at in 1924. I insert the report of the speech given in 1952 here verbatim. It was originally made available to an American publication, Common Sense, by Mr. Eustace Mullins, an authority on the Marxist conspiracy. A report from Europe carries the following speech of Rabbi Emanuel Rabinovich before a special meeting of the Emergency Council of European Rabbis in Budapest, Hungary, January 12, 1952. Greetings, my children. You have been called here to recapitulate the principal steps of our new program. As you know, we had hoped to have 20 years between wars to consolidate the great gains which we made from World War II. But our increasing numbers in certain vital areas is arousing opposition to us, and we must now work with every means at our disposal to precipitate World War III within 5 years. The goal for which we have striven so concertedly for 3,000 years is at last within our reach. And because its fulfillment is so apparent, it behooves us to increase our efforts and our caution tenfold. I can safely promise you that before 10 years have passed, our race will take its rightful place in the world, with every Jew a king and every Gentile a slave. Applause from the gathering. You remember the success of our propaganda campaign during the 1930s, which aroused anti-American passions in Germany. At the same time, we were arousing anti-German passions in America, a campaign which culminated in the Second World War. A similar propaganda campaign is now being waged intentionally throughout the world. A war fever is being worked up in Russia by an incessant anti-American barrage. While a nationwide anti-communist scare is sweeping America, this campaign is forcing all the other smaller nations to choose between the partnership of Russia or an alliance with the United States. Our most pressing problem at the moment is to inflame the lagging militaristic spirits of the Americans. The failure of the Universal Military Training Act was a great setback to our plans, but we are assured that the suitable measure will be rushed through Congress immediately after the 1952 elections. The Russian, as well as the Asiatic peoples, are well under control and offer no objections to war. But we must wait to secure the Americans. This we hope to do with the issue of anti-Semitism, which worked so well in uniting the Americans against Germany. We are counting heavily on reports of anti-Semitic outrages in Russia to help whip up indignation in the United States and produce a front of solidarity against the Soviet power. Simultaneously, to demonstrate to Americans the reality of anti-Semitism, we will advance through news sources large sums of money to outspokenly anti-Semitic elements in America to increase their effectiveness, and we shall stage anti-Semitic outbreaks in several other large cities. This will serve the double purpose of exposing reactionary sectors in America, which can be silenced, and of welding the United States into a devoted anti-Russian unit. Within 5 years, this program will achieve its objective, the Third World War, which will surpass its destruction all previous contests. Israel, of course, will remain neutral, and when both sides are devastated and exhausted, we will arbitrate, sending our control commission into all wrecked countries. This war will end for all time our struggle against the Gentiles. We will openly reveal our identity with the races of Asia and Africa. I can state with assurance that the last generation of white children is now being born. Our control commissions will, in the interests of peace and wiping out interracial tensions, forbid the whites to mate with whites. The white woman must cohabit with members of the dark races, and the white men with black women. Thus, the white race will disappear, for mixing the dark with the white means the end of the white man, and our most dangerous enemy will become only a memory. We shall embark upon an era of 10,000 years of peace and plenty. The Pax Judacia, Ju- Ju- Judaica, and our race will rule undisputed over the world. Our superior intelligence will easily enable us to retain mastery over a world of dark peoples. Questions from the gathering. Rabbi Rabinovich, what about the various religions after the Third World War? Rabinovich, there will be no more religions. Not only would the existence of a priest class remain a contestant danger to our rule, but belief in an afterlife would give spiritual strength to irreconcilable elements in many countries and enable them to resist us. We will, however, retain the rituals and customs of Judaism as the mark of our heredity ruling caste, strengthening our racial laws so that no Jew will be allowed to marry outside our race, nor will any stranger be accepted by us. We may have to repeat the grim days of the World War II, when we were forced to let the Hitlerite bandits sacrifice some of our people in order that we may have adequate documentation and witnesses to legally justify our trials and executions of the leaders of America and Russia as war criminals after we have dictated the peace. I'm sure you will need little preparation for such a duty, for sacrifice has always been the watchword of our people, and the death of a few thousand Jews in exchange for world leadership is indeed a small price to pay. To convince you of the certainty of that leadership, let me point out to you how we have turned all of the inventions of the white man into weapons against him. His printing presses and radios are the mouthpieces of our desires, and his heavy industry manufactures the instruments with which he sends out to arm Asia and Africa against him. Our interests in Washington are greatly extending the Point 4 program for developing industry in backward areas of the world, so that after the industrial plants and cities of Europe and America are destroyed by atomic warfare, the whites can offer no resistance against the large masses of the dark races who will maintain an unchallenged technological superiority. And so, with the vision of the world victory before you, go back to your countries and intensify your good work until that approaching light when Israel will reveal herself in all her glorious destiny as the lights of the world. Illuminati means holder of the light. This speech also confirms what I have contended in regard to the manner in which the secret powers have deliberately stirred up anti-Semitism to suit their purposes and also anti-communism. It proves my contention that the Illuminati have used communism, Zionism, and fascism to further their secret ambitions, and they will, if they can, use Christian democracy against communism to bring about the next phase of their long-range plan, World War III. But the most illuminating feature of the speech is the fact that it discloses the manner in which the Illuminati uses a Jewish rabbi to convince another co-religionists that they will be the governing class in the New World Order. A fact that past history would indicate is very doubtful. Satanism, not the Jews, will rule. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the international bankers obtained control over Germany's military rearmament and her economic recovery. This accomplished, they entered into the Amachungen agreements with the German high commands. They agreed to have the Soviets secretly supply the German generals with all the arms and munition they required for a modern army of several million. They also undertook to have the Soviet dictator place complete training facilities at the disposal of the Germans to enable them to train the number of commissioned and non-commissioned officers they would require to officer the new army they planned to bring into being when they considered the time was right. The vast building projects required to put the terms of the Amachujens into effect were financed by the international bankers. They thus enabled both communist and fascist countries to build up their economy and war potentials. The international bankers enabled the German High Command to evade all the military restrictions placed upon them by the Treaty of Versailles. The vast Crump munitions and armaments plants built in the Soviets behind the Ural Mountains were named Manich. The German armament firms were granted every concession they asked for. International intrigue on such a lavish scale could only mean one thing. Those involved were preparing for World War II. The governments of the so-called Allied nations were kept fully informed regarding what was going on behind the scenes, as I found out when I visited London during the Conference on Naval Disarmaments in 1930. This is only another proof that Disraeli spoke the truth when he said, "The governments elected do not govern." Thus, history reveals that from 1920 to 1934, the secret power directed international intrigue in such a manner that the leaders of allegedly Jewish-dominated communism in Russia were working hand in glove with the leaders of allegedly Aryan-dominated Nazism in Germany. This phase of history is most complicated. It is difficult for the average citizen to understand. Communism and Nazism have several things in common. Both are atheistic creeds which deny the existence of Almighty God. They both advocate war, hatred, and force, as opposed to Christ's policy of peace, love, and teaching. The leaders of both atheistic materialistic ideologies must therefore be agents of the devil. They further the diabolical conspiracy to win the souls of men away from the loyalty and obedience to Almighty God. They both use a form of Grand Orient Masonry for proselytizing purposes. The head of the Council of 33 is the president of the top executives Council of 13, previously referred to, because The initiating ceremonies of all Grand Orient Lodges require the candidate to swear he will acknowledge no other mortal as above the head of the organization. That head is automatically God on earth. The international bankers have always been the top executives of the Grand Orient Masonry since 1770. The Aryan warlords have always been the top executives of the German lodges. They select their own successors. A review of history, 1914 to 1934, indicates 1. That the international bankers fomented World War I to bring about conditions favorable for the revolutionary action and thus enable them to obtain undisputed control of the Russian Empire. 2. To remove the crowned heads of Europe. These rulers had to be removed before either group could achieve their totalitarian ambitions. 3. To force the British and French governments to agree to establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine. The government of Britain was forced to aid the international bankers' plan for the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 in order to obtain their promise that they would bring America into the war on the side of the Allies. It can be assumed that SS Lusitania was sunk to provide the necessary incident to justify the changer of American policy, just as Pearl Harbor was used as an excuse for America to enter the war in World War II. The original draft of the mandate on Palestine reads, to turn Palestine into a national home for the Jews. It was altered at the last minute to read, to establish a national home for the Jew in Palestine. This was done to conceal the secret ambition of the Zionists. The international bankers deliberately concealed the truth regarding the vast mineral deposits geologists had discovered in Palestine until after the governments of Britain, France, and the United States had agreed to the mandate of Palestine. The international bankers used Zionism to obtain control of the centrally located sovereign states, from which they could extend the control they now exert over the USSRs to cover the entire world. The conspirators managed international affairs between 1921 and 1934, so that Europe was divided into two camps, fascists and anti-fascists, in preparation for World War II.